Well, welcome to a message that we're calling The Best Explanation. And we're in the middle of a dialogue. Some of you have been in on this at our campuses or online, that we have been talking about one of the questions that's just been perplexing to people, regardless of the generation that they've lived in, or regardless even of whether you're Christian or not. It's sort of a human question, which is if there's actually a God, like there really is a God, and he's good and he's loving, then why is the world the way it is, and why is my life the way it is? And what we said from the very outset is that we might not be able to answer this like, oh, here's the answer that everybody can understand, and here's the answer that everybody, this is just going to change things forever and ever. But we will actually try to address the question. And I think we can address it in such a way that I hope and I pray we are going to be actually able to help you. And I hope it's going to become a very helpful series. And we started out by asking this question this way. We simply said, is there in sort of God's economy a reason behind this? And even though we couldn't really find a reason behind it, and that may be something that we figure out in heaven, we do know a few things about God. And we saw the story of a guy named Job, and Job had an incredibly difficult life. You may feel you've had a difficult life, but you got to read Job's story because it rivals among some of the most difficult circumstances that I think you can imagine a person going through. And at the end of the day, he had lots of questions about God. He wanted to know why. But he had an encounter with God. Rather than just talking about God, he went to God, and he had an encounter with God that completely changed his perspective. And one of the things that we saw as a result of our encounter with Job is that Job got a glimpse of God's goodness. And when he saw how good God was, his desire for an explanation just kind of faded away. And we said this, that confidence in God's goodness transcends confidence and understanding. And as much as you and I kind of search for an explanation, thinking that it's the explanation, oh, this is why that happened, and you see, if this hadn't happened, then that would have happened, and then because this happened, that happened, we think that's going to satisfy us. Job saw something much more profound. He actually saw the character and the heart of God after engaging with God for days on end of dialogue and debate, and he just went, wow, God is good. That's all I need to know. He's got my back. And I'm just going to be quiet now. That's basically what he said. And then we also saw in part 2 of the series that there are moments, and you've all experienced them, I've experienced them, you don't have to be a Christian to experience them. It just feels like if there really is a God, he's doing something to us. None of the circumstances really line up the way we hope they would line up. And sometimes we said when it looks like God is doing something to us, he's actually doing something in us so that he can do something through us. So rather than saying, God, why are you doing this to me? Why do you do this to me? We change the question and say, God, what are you doing in me so that you can do something through me down the road? And today, I'll tell you, this wraps up the series for our Aurelia campus. So if you're part of our Barrie campus, this is sort of halfway through the message. But if you're in Aurelia, you've already seen that God's ultimate answer is not no. And we will see that at our Barrie campus very shortly, that God's ultimate answer is not no. That God has a very, very different answer. God ultimately has said yes to humanity, not no to humanity, and that's really what the whole Easter event is all about. But it still leaves us with questions, and that's why I wanted to talk this week about a story that is incredible and about a phenomena that happens to you regardless of where you are in your Christian walk. Because here's what happens to you. When there is a gap in information, and always in our story, always in our lives, there are gaps in information. So you get to the point where you're like, I don't really understand why this is happening, and here's what you'll do. Here's what I do. Here's what just about everybody does. When there's a gap in information, you try to supply an explanation. You try to just create something. And it's like, okay, so your kids are not home on time. The question is, what are you going to do? You're not going to say, well, I have zero information and I don't care. You're going to try to figure out, even if you don't know what happened, you're going to try to create an explanation. And so you're going to say, well, maybe the class ran a little bit late, or maybe he's still at his friend's house, or maybe the walk home took a little bit longer, or maybe, he's getting dropped off, maybe the car broke down or something. Then naturally, as any parent would, you're going to try to find out whether your explanation that you're making up in your head, and some of us just go immediately to the bad stuff. Oh, I'm sure there was a horrific accident president, or whatever. But you're going to try to figure out whether that's actually true or not. And even in the simple things of life, when you're not really sure, you'll make something up. You ever notice that, whether you're listening to iTunes or the radio or your favorite music CD, something? You don't know the words to a song, so you just kind of make them up. You just make that up. And Jordan, my oldest, when he was 8 years old, we were listening to BTO one day, and he came out, and we said, oh, let's put on Taking Care of Business. And he goes, that's what that song is? He said, Dad, I thought it was Baking Carrots Biscuits. He thought it was Baking Carrot Biscuits. So it's like, no, that's not actually what it is, son. But you do that, right? If you don't know, you just make something up. And you see, that happens in life, and it also happens in our explanation of how we try to figure out what life is really all about. And so if you've got a series of negative circumstances at work in your life right now, you're trying to figure out, if you believe in God, or even people who don't believe in God do this, if there's a God, why is this happening? Why did she, or why is this going on in the company? Or how come in my marriage, or financially, or I've got an internal struggle I can't seem to get past. And so you ask yourself all the time, why, God, would you actually do this? Why is this happening? I don't get it. I don't understand it. And you supply an explanation. And for some of you, you've been in a circumstance, you are in a circumstance in life for some of you where it's like, well, it must just be that God doesn't care. It must just be that God actually doesn't care about me. Or maybe he's powerless. Or maybe, he caused it, or maybe he didn't cause it. Or you're struggling to try to figure out why it's happening. And it's just human nature, you will supply an explanation. An atheist would say, well, there is no God, so this is just human cause and effect or random chance. An agnostic, somebody who's not sure what they believe, might say, well, if there really is a God, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think he might be trying to do this. And even Christians, Christians struggle with this. It's like, well, maybe God did this so that this, or maybe God just doesn't really care, or maybe there's something wrong in my life. You're just trying to figure out. Now, what a responsible person will do is a responsible person will try to figure out what my part in a situation is, what their part in a situation is. So if you're a responsible person, I know we're all responsible people, when there's a problem in your marriage, all right, the tendency is to want to blame. It's like, well, it's all his fault. And if he hadn't, and if she hadn't, and if, on we go. A responsible person says, look, it's not all their fault. It can't be all their fault. Here's what I contributed, and you do some self-analysis and some self-reflection. There's problems at work, right? There's a disagreement between your coworkers, or there's a problem with the management. You're like, look, not all of this is my responsibility, but some of this is my responsibility. And so I need to figure out, as a responsible human being, what part of this is my problem. And so you try to figure out what your problem is. And so you go, well, I think when I did this, it caused that, so I need to take responsibility for that. I shouldn't probably interact in that way or in that style, so I need to stop doing that. I shouldn't have sent that email. I shouldn't have sent that memo. And so you kind of own what is your part. And then the rest of it might be bigger than that, but that's what responsible people do. Right? If there's an economic downturn, or your financial situation isn't great, some of that might be external. I took a pay cut, or, so-and-so lost their job, or the company's not doing well. But it's like, well, those are external circumstances, but what can I do? What is my responsibility? And so responsible people, when they're trying to sort out cause and effect, will always try to figure out what part of this, as hard as it is to admit, as hard as it is to look at, what part of this is my responsibility. But then there's the rest of it, right? Like, how are you going to explain the rest of it? So I'm responsible for 30%, or I'm responsible for 80%, or I'm responsible for 60%. But what about the other 40%? And sometimes we can trace out human factors. Well, it's this or that. And sometimes it's just left into the jaws of a mystery. And we don't really know why it happened, and that's where God sort of plays a part of it. Or you get a number of circumstances that seem to align against you, and then it's like, God, this just isn't fair. Well, we're going to look today at the story of somebody in the Old Testament who had the most incredible life. He's one of my favorite characters. And, if you've got a hard luck story, his would probably at least get close to yours. He had an unbelievable life. You probably have heard of him, even if you don't read the Bible, and I think you should read the Bible. It's an incredible story. But you probably have heard of him because there's been plays made about him and theater productions and movies, and I mean, he's quite famous. But he was born into a family with a lot of siblings, and it was a hyper-dysfunctional family. You think reality TV has a leg up, you should just read the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Unbelievable. Very dysfunctional family, and his brothers didn't like him. There was conflict between the parents, but his brothers really didn't like him. And he was one of those sort of golden boy children, you know, he always did well, and there was favor around him, and he was kind of his dad's favorite. Not a good idea if you're a parent to favor a child, but this is what his dad did. So his siblings got very upset with him. And his siblings, there was a lot of sibling rivalry. They actually decided they were going to kill him. They were so upset with him, they decided they were going to murder him. So they took him out into the field one day, and they were ready to kill him. And then the older brother said, oh, maybe we shouldn't kill him. You know, smart guy. Okay, maybe we shouldn't kill him. Maybe we should just sell him into slavery. So that's what they did. They sold him to a group of Midianite traders. That was another ethnic group in their area. They sold him to some Midianite traders. They took his coat. He had a very famous coat. They ripped it up. They poured blood on it. They went home after this guy was gone, and they said, look at what happened to your son, Dad. He got killed by a wild animal. This is what we found. Too bad. We think he's dead. But they had sold him. So imagine being him, and imagine how you would feel. So he gets sold by Midianite traders. He ends up in Egypt, and he gets a bit of a break. He ends up being an attendant, a servant in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar is an Egyptian bureaucrat. He does well, living in very comfortable circumstances, and he is there to serve Potiphar. He does very well. He gets promoted. But Potiphar has a very beautiful wife, and Joseph, this guy we're looking at today, Joseph is a young teenage, sort of, built, chiseled guy, and Potiphar's wife and Joseph are alone one day, and Potiphar's wife decides, I think I want to sleep with this guy. So she says, why don't you come over? He goes, no, I wouldn't do that kind of thing, and she gets disappointed and spurned, and so she starts screaming, rape, 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 and he gets arrested. He gets accused falsely of raping her. He gets thrown into prison. He goes into prison. He's there with a couple of other guys. One of the guys gets a break. He goes, hey, can you remember me? I'm the innocent guy in prison. Can you please tell the powers that be that I should get out of prison and I was wrongly accused? And so he says, sure, we'll get you out of prison. Forgets about him entirely. Left for years to rot in prison. And then one day, through a variety of circumstances, he gets let out of prison, and once again, he's a fine character. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, finds him and starts promoting him, and he becomes the prime minister of Egypt. And God has shown him in a dream that there's going to be 7 years that have a lot of crops, a lot of good years, and then some lean years that follow. So Joseph has a plan, and he stores up all this food, and we meet him at a moment, if you know the story at all. He has started an exchange with his brothers, and his brothers have come back to Egypt because there's now a famine across the entire Middle East. And so they're still in Israel, and he's down in Egypt. And they come over from Israel, and they go to get grain, and they have to see the prime minister, who they don't know is their brother, Joseph. And the scene that we're going to walk into is what you might call the reveal. All right? So he and his brothers have been going back and forth. His brothers have no idea that this is Joseph. He knows it's them. But Joseph, of course, was traded away when he was a teenager, so he kind of looks Egyptian. He speaks Egyptian. They don't realize he understands Hebrew, and so he's listening in even while he's speaking Egyptian to them. And so he's kept his identity disguised, and the few verses we're going to read today come right out of the reveal, and it's very suspenseful. And as powerful as the story is, I've read this story and I've seen the story many, many times over my life. But I was just reading this in, Genesis, sort of start the Bible over again for a new year. So I was reading this a number of months ago, and I came across this, and I've read it dozens of times, but my jaw dropped when I read this passage. I'd never quite seen it in those terms before. I'm kind of a Bible nerd, all right? So it wasn't like really, dramatic. It just felt really dramatic to me. I'd never seen Joseph talk. Like, I just missed his explanation for all of this, and I think it's absolutely incredible how he explained all of the events that had happened to him at that point in his life. So if you got your Bibles, open them to Genesis chapter 45, first book of the Bible, Genesis 45, verses 1 through 8, and we'll see Joseph revealing his identity to his brothers. So, verse 1, Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Now, you can imagine the tension in the room. This has been years since his brothers would even know that Joseph was alive. They assumed he was probably dead or in some foreign land or obscure or sold into slavery. I mean, they don't really know. They don't really care. They have no idea what's happening. And you can imagine how emotional this would be for Joseph. Look at the next couple of verses. Verse 2, then he, Joseph, broke down and wept. And he wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I mean, can you imagine, just for a moment, put yourself in Joseph's headspace. He's been suffering since he was a child. You know, not a great home environment. It's difficult. His brothers, his siblings, sold him into slavery and seriously, like, almost killed him. You imagine the emotional scars he would carry in that moment? And then, you know, he gets falsely accused and he gets thrown into prison, and then he has an opportunity to leave prison and he's promised release, and then everybody forgets about him and he has to rot away for a few more years. I mean, his life has not been going well until the last year or two. You can imagine the emotional pain that he's in, and you can imagine how he would be searching for an explanation. God, why did you allow this to happen? Is this actually why you had me born? Like, did I actually come into the planet for this? Is this why this is supposed to be taking place? Like, this doesn't make any sense at all. And suddenly, all of this is going to be revealed, and we move into a pivotal moment in his life. So you can just imagine the tension he's feeling, and here comes the reveal. Verse 3, I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Now, their jaws would have dropped at that. It's like, Joseph, really? This is not good. Okay, next part of the verse. He asks, is my father still alive? But his brothers, naturally, were speechless. They were stunned to realize Joseph was standing there in front of them. You just imagine they're starting to gulp. It's like, oh my goodness. He is alive. He is a powerful man. We're in the room with him alone. What's going to happen? Verse 4, please come closer, he said to them. Joseph said to his brothers. Now, at this moment, what's your plan if you're the brothers, right? I don't see Jack Bauer or Chuck Norris nearby. We could be in serious trouble here. Like, he is, think about it, he is the most powerful man in what at that time was the most powerful nation in the world. You say, well, what about Pharaoh, the king? It says the king didn't even really do anything without consulting with Joseph. Joseph was that smart. So he's got all power. He's got all authority. There's nobody else in the room. He can do whatever he would like to do. Now, question for you. What would you do if you were Joseph? It's like, whoo, I've been saving up for this day for a long time, and brothers, you are going to pay, all right? Do you know how cold it was in prison? Do you know how deep that well was? Do you know how scared I was? Do you know that I didn't sleep for years? Do you know, like, you could do payback here in such a huge way because you're the guy. You've got the chariots of a superpower at your beck and call. You've got every soldier. You've got all power. You've got all authority. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want, and now your brothers are right there. They're eating out of your hand. You can make life miserable for them. This is your opportunity, see, when you get power, to use it in a way that hurts the people who have hurt you. We've all seen people do that. Watch what Joseph does. Okay, so they came closer. Having no rescuer, they came closer. And again he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery. It's a perfect setup for revenge, isn't it? Perfect setup for just, you guys are going to pay. and you're going to pay so bad. I spent 10 years in prison. You're going to spend 100 years, all right? And it's going to be even colder and even darker. Look at what he says, verse 5. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. This is huge. See, there is something going on inside of Joseph that is so powerful. This is why he's one of my heroes. I mean, he is saying the first words out of his mouth is, don't be upset with yourself. I mean, would those, honestly, would those be the words out of your mouth? I mean, a lot of us would have been rehearsing for this moment for years. If I ever get that opportunity. I mean, come on. We all have people in our lives. It's like, well, if I ever see her again, or if I ever see my ex, or if I ever see my old boss, or if I ever see that 5th grade teacher, all right? If I ever get them in front of me and I have the opportunity, I'm going to tell them, they're going to hear it. And he goes, what does he say? Don't blame yourself. Don't be upset with yourself. He says, and this is the part that made my jaw drop. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Wow. It was what? It was God? Okay, think about for a moment what it would take for Joseph to actually say that. Think about what it would take for Joseph to be at a place. I mean, you've had years to think about this. And what has to be true inside of you for you to believe that God did this? You see, he would have had to think, okay, so God let me get born into a dysfunctional family. God made my brothers almost kill me. God made my brothers sell me to some traders. God let me get falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. God let me rot in prison. God missed all those opportunities, and now God has brought me out. It's wow. Wow, that's huge. But Joseph obviously has a lot of time to process, and he decides that God is behind it all. Now, I know what some of you are doing already because you're starting to look at the tragedy in your life and the bad circumstances in your life. And I know there are some heartbreaking stories. And you're starting to say, wait a minute, is this where you're going? You're going to say when she died that God. You're going to say when the car accident happened, that was God. You're going to say when I got fired? Okay. You're going to say our financial situation. Oh, God did it? Now, that is a huge conclusion to draw. I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm not sure in every moment that we can exactly trace out cause and effect. What I am going to say is this. Joseph decided that God caused all of that. And why would he do it? Why would he do that? I think Joseph did it because he needed an explanation. I mean, if you're sitting there in prison rotting away and that's your life, you've got to figure out what happened. And you either decide that God is not in it or you decide that God is in it. He went a step further and he said, not only is God in it, I'm going to believe that God caused it. That is going to be my explanation. I'm going to believe that God caused it. I'm going to believe that God did it. And here's what I believe happened. Because if you study Joseph, he is an exemplary character. Unbelievable character. And I think what he decided was, if I know that God is in this, and if I'm even willing to say in my own mind that God caused it, then I'm going to conduct myself in such a way that God is in the middle of all of my circumstances. When I was in the well, God was there. When I was in prison, God was there. When I was falsely accused, God was there. When I got forgotten again and nobody paid attention to me, God was there. And he just made a decision that he was going to conduct himself in such a way that no matter what the circumstance, no matter how bad it got, no matter how difficult it was, God was with him in the middle of that. He just made a decision that God was going to be with him. And if you study the book of Genesis, you'll see that it says God actually was with him. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. But Joseph had to come to a place where he just decided that God was in the middle of his misery. And I think, and I'm not saying you have to do this, okay? I wouldn't do that because for some of you, you're going to go, oh, that's too painful. I can't. I can't say that God was behind that death. I can't say that God caused that. But was God there? God was there. Was God available to you? God was available to you because we all invent our own explanations. And you could easily be sitting in prison going, you know what? God isn't there. God doesn't care. God wouldn't allow me to be born into that kind of family. God wouldn't allow my brothers and my sister to sell me into slavery. God wouldn't allow me to get falsely accused. God wouldn't allow me to be in prison. And if you did, if you caused it, I don't even like you. I hate you. If you caused that, some kind of God you are, Joseph, saying it to his brothers, I just decided not to go there. I just decided that God caused it, and I needed to respond. And Joseph, if you study him, he's one of my heroes. Joseph, Daniel, a few others in the Old Testament. If you study him, he is a man of integrity. And when he decided that God was in the worst of circumstances, he ran away from a really hot wife. It's like, I'm not going there. I'm going to run away. It landed me in prison. I'm not even going to, I didn't even do it. Now I'm in prison. He just decided that God was in the middle of it. And if God was in the middle of it, then he wasn't going to be removed from God, and he was going to behave as though God was watching and God was responsible. And so what you see in Joseph's life is a man of incredible character under very difficult circumstances. So when he's in prison, he gets appointed sort of, lead guy, head over the guards. It's like big promotion. It's not really what I was hoping for career-wise, but I'll take it. I'm in jail. I got a promotion. Fine. But what happens, because God is shaping his character, and he decides not to get angry with God. I mean, I'm sure he had his moments, but he decides fundamentally God is in it. I'll even tell you God did it. When a break comes his way, he says, well, this break didn't come my way for me. This came my way for the benefit of other people. If I'm made prime minister of Egypt, I'm going to use that in such a way that it will benefit other people. And in fact, he goes on to save the entire ancient Near East by storing up grain and making sure that people, including the people of Israel, survived the famine. And so his character in the worst of times also shapes his character in the best of times. His decision that God was in it shaped his crisis, but it also shaped his success. And I think Joseph was somebody who realized that it is much harder to have faith when God says no than when he says yes. I mean, tax refund time, right? You get your income tax done. There's that moment of drama. Are we getting a refund? Do we have to pay? How does that work? And you're very reliant on God in that moment, right? It's like, come on, God, refund, refund, refund. But then, when you find out, I got a refund, it's easy to go, whew, check's mine. Thank you, God. Appreciate that. But, we don't need you anymore. Joseph didn't do that. He said, you were with me in the bad times. These good times didn't come to me for my benefit. You see, that's the opportunity for some of us to sit back and go, whew, I'm prime minister of Egypt. Got the nice car, got the big mansion, got the world-traveling vacations. I'm just going to use this for my benefit. Why? Because it's payback. That's why. You should see my tough childhood. You should see my dysfunctional family. You should see my murderous brothers. You should see all that. And so I'm just making up for lost time. Joseph was like, no. And he lived in a very nice palace, but it's like, how can I use, and this is huge, how can I use my power to the glory of God and to the benefit of others? It's his character at work. Powerful, powerful. Joseph says, and see this, oh man, his reveal, he can do whatever he wants to his brothers. Don't blame yourself. God did this. And I'm here actually to save you, and to save my family, and to save my people. It's not payback. How do you get there with your ex? How do you get there with the guy who fired you? How do you get there with the property association? How do you get there with that teacher you never liked? How do you get there with the enemies in your life? How do you get to the place where it's like, oh, this isn't time for payback. This is an opportunity for grace. This is an opportunity to realize that we have a very loving God, and he forgives, and despite our circumstances, he's here. in the middle of it. And I'm going to use my power not to harm you, but to help you. See, I think Joseph deciding that God caused it, that was his explanation, because we're all going to try to find an explanation. Joseph deciding that God caused it helped him to believe that God was in it. And if God was in it, even if I'm in the worst circumstances possible, I have to believe that God is not removed from me. And I have to conduct myself in a way that is honorable and right. And therefore, when the break comes my way, I have to conduct myself as though this is not just for my benefit. I've got to use it to honor and glorify God, because if my crisis came from God, the success comes from God, and I'm just going to live as though it all comes from God, and I'm going to believe that God is in it, and that's going to give me hope, and that's going to give me an opportunity to respond differently than just about anybody would respond. So that's what Joseph did. And then he goes on. I mean, we're halfway through the story. Look at this. Next verse, verse 6. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, he tells his brothers, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Here it is again, verse 7. God has sent me. Who did this? God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So, verse 8, just in case you missed it. So it was God who sent me here, not you. Don't blame yourselves. And he, last verse, is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all of Egypt. Wow. Isn't that unbelievable that Joseph would say that? Like, that just floors me that he would say it. There is a man of unbelievable character. So why is this so important? Why is it relevant? Why is it important to you? It's huge, because here's what's true. When bad things come your way, you are going to make up an explanation, and you're going to decide about God's role in it. And you're going to decide, God doesn't love me, God doesn't care about me, God, oh, if you were really a good God, then you wouldn't do this, and I don't believe you, and I can't believe you would do this, and why would this happen to me? It's called a pity party. That's one of the explanations you'll come up with. Or you'll be tempted to blame everybody. Well, see, if I hadn't married her, if I hadn't married him, if I never joined that company, if it wasn't for the economy, if it wasn't, I think what Joseph did, and reading between the lines a bit, he took responsibility for what part was his. Probably shouldn't have teased my brothers, in retrospect. That was a bad idea, seeing as they tried to kill me. So he probably did things like that, where he went back, but he took responsibility. And he didn't allow his circumstances to define him. He just decided that he was going to define his circumstances. And he decided, if I'm going to be in jail, I'm going to conduct myself in a way as though God was with me, even though I'm in jail. And they promoted him to a position of leadership, even in the jail. Even though I didn't do that, I'm just going to do the best I can, and I'm going to take responsibility. I'll apologize where I need to apologize. I will do that, but I'm just going to behave as though God is with me. And he invited God into the worst of his circumstances. And what often happens is, with the explanations that you and I create, they exclude God. Christians do this, non-Christians do this. It's just like, no, I'm just in the middle of a mess. In fact, I'm in such a mess, I'm not even going to look at my part of the mess, because I don't want to be responsible. I'm just going to blame everybody else. But one of the ways of getting out of that mess, whether it's financial or relational or work-wise or whatever it happens to be, if you're in that mess, you look at what part you own and say, okay, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. You say, God, what do you want to do with that? You want to chisel my character when it looks like God is doing something to you. He wants to do something in you so he can do something through you. Okay. That's what that's about. All right, well, I'm sorry, and I probably need to say sorry to him, and I probably need to say sorry to them, and I probably need to get to the place where, when I have my moment, when I have my Joseph moment, and everybody's assembled before me, and there's nobody else in the room, and I have power and resources and authority and all that stuff, I want to get to a place where I can exercise grace, and I can exercise forgiveness, and not, get the cheap shot, or, now you're going to get what's going to you, what's coming to you. You want to get to that place. And that's the journey that Joseph was in, I'm sure, as he was being traded by the Midianites and in Potiphar's house and in jail. He just got to a point where he decided, his explanation went maybe further than yours will go, and I'm not saying you have to walk out of here saying, God did this. Truthfully, we did a lot of this to ourselves. And some of it inexplicable. Some of it God may have actually engineered. I don't know. I can't figure that out. All I know is Joseph decided that God did it to him. And he took responsibility for what was his part. And he decided, see, what that enabled him to do was to say, God is in this. This may be a terrible situation. God is in it. And the reason that that's so critical is because some of us are in moments like that. We've been there, we are, or we will be this week. You'll get a phone call Wednesday afternoon, something will happen. You'll end up in a car accident. You'll end up with a diagnosis. You'll end up with something happening. You get the phone call that makes you go, and you'll have to decide whether God's in it or whether God's not in it. And you'll have to decide how you're going to conduct yourself. And you will either invite God into the center of that or you will exclude God from the center of that. It's your decision and you'll make that move. But I'll promise you this, that story that we read this morning would not have been written the way it was, I don't believe, if God wasn't at the center of Joseph's explanation. Because most of us would have just gotten up there and said, okay, payback. That's what this is. Or I can't believe you guys, and I want nothing to do with you, and I just had to say that and get that off my chest. It's been a decade, and now I feel better. Get out of here. You don't write the story Joseph wrote without God at the center of it. And that is God's story. He'll show up anywhere. See, some of you have probably said, no. See, my circumstance, my crisis is so deep that God couldn't possibly be at the center of it. Well, you can conclude that. If that's the best explanation you can come up with, that's up to you. But I would say, God would say, invite me into the middle of it. Just invite me into it. I know you think it's terrible. I know you think it's unfixable. Invite me into the middle of it, and we'll start a dialogue. And I promise you that, if Joseph can come out of that with a whole new character, your circumstance will look different, your outcome will look different, but this is a God who loves meeting his people in the worst of circumstances, and who loves to take those terrible circumstances and shape them and mold them to his glory. Powerful, powerful God, powerful story. So the question this week, think about the circumstance that you're in. Think about the circumstance. Maybe you just got out of one. Maybe you're in one right now. Or think about the circumstance that will come, because it will happen. You'll either get a bunch of little things or a big thing or a couple of big things, and some of them are just huge. And you will come up with an explanation as to why that happened. And I'm not telling you that you need to decide that God caused it, but I am telling you this. If you invite God into the middle of it, if you behave as though God is very present, even though you can't understand it, even though it makes no sense, even though you never would have written the story that way, God suddenly says, now I got somebody I can use. It's like, look at that. They're listening. They're not letting the circumstance remove. Hey, they're even willing to look inside. They're willing to look at what they've contributed. Oh my goodness, we got a live one here. We can use this person. Unbelievable. And that's exactly what he did with Joseph. I don't mind you becoming prime minister of Egypt. I don't mind you, and most of us are probably not going to become the prime minister of Egypt or Canada. But whatever world we function in, God said, I'll use you to bring grace. I'll use you to bring forgiveness. Man, if you want to use power to benefit other people, I might even give you more power. If you want to turn this situation around, I might give you another situation to turn around. And Joseph, in the worst of circumstances, believed that God had engineered the whole thing. God was in the middle of it. The best thing that you can do when you face a crisis is decide, no matter how bad it is, no matter how frustrated you are, no matter how tempted you are to believe that God couldn't possibly be in this, believe that God's in it. Invite him in. Some of you have been carrying situations for years. It's like, yeah, God. Invite him in. Some of you are struggling with addictions. For some of you, it's your marriage. For some of you, it's your finances. For some of you, it's a situation at work. For some of you, it's just relationships. I don't know what it is. You know, God knows. And you've excluded God. It's like you're just mad at him or mad at the world or mad at somebody. Invite him in. You don't have to decide God did it, but you can invite him in. And when you invite him in and you take ownership and responsibility for your part in it, and you confess your part in it, and you say, God, I'm just inviting you in. Man, God was with Joseph in prison. He was with Joseph in the false accusation, and he was with Joseph when he was prime minister. Decide that God is in it. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, today, I ask that many of us who have been holding you out of particular circumstances would invite you in to those circumstances. And maybe some of us aren't ready to do what Joseph did and said, you caused it. In fact, if some of us look into it, we'll realize, oh my goodness, I think I caused that, if we were to be really honest. But everything's redeemable. You love to get into the brokenness of human life and begin the repair. And you mend relationships, and you mend hearts, and you mend character. And you help us take responsibility for those things, Lord, that we don't want to take responsibility for. And when we invite you into the middle of it, God, amazing things happen. Joseph never lost hope, even in the darkest days. And Lord, I thank you that when he got power and authority and resources, he didn't just use them for personal pleasure. He used them to benefit other people. Thank you. And Father, I just pray for some of us today, we may actually be inviting you into a circumstance for the very first time. We wouldn't even consider ourselves Christians, but we're just saying, God, I think I want to invite you in. And Lord, may that give us inspired confidence. And I pray that as a result of that, there are many hearing this message who will, for the first time, put their faith and their trust and confidence in Jesus Christ. And Father, for those of us here who, Lord, we're Christians, but we really don't invite you into all the circumstances, and we don't even take responsibility for our role in them. We just blame you for it all. Forgive us. We invite you into the middle of us. Show us what part of it is ours. Show us what part of it belongs to others, and whether we can ever trace out cause and effect. Just help us, Lord, to rely on you. Shape our character. Change who we are. And may our best explanation be that God is in it, that God is with us. We trust you and we worship you. In Jesus' name, amen.